Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we begin with the strange and rather hilarious story of how people in the 1600s actually sold bottled farts as medicine. Yes, truly. In an age when the plague still haunted London and science was only just beginning to take shape, some believed that captured air could heal the sick, and others were willing to pay handsomely for it. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now let's get on with today's story. And please, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a quiet fan for a bit of background hum, and let's travel together into this bizarre corner of forgotten history. I was 17 years of age when I first learnt to trap air inside a bottle, and I am an old man now, with fingers too stiff to properly seal a vial and eyes that water in bright light. Yet I remember those days with such clarity that I might be standing once more in Master Cornelius's workshop, watching the morning sun slant through leaded glass, whilst the sweet, sharp smell of rosemary and brimstone hung thick in the air. We believed in those years that the very breath of things could heal or harm, that sickness travelled on the wind, and that salvation might be captured in a vessel no larger than a child's fist. This is the story of what we sold, and why we sold it, and what it meant to those who bought our wares in the dim years after the great sickness had passed through London, like the angel of judgment itself. I tell it not to mock the ignorance of those times, for we were not foolish people, but desperate ones, living in an age when understanding had not yet caught up with suffering. We did what we could with what we knew, and if we were wrong, well, are we not all wrong about something until time proves us so? The year was 1667, 2 years after the plague had emptied whole streets and left the city smelling of quicklime and burning thatch. I had survived by fortune alone, for my master had sent me to his sister's house in Hertfordshire when the first black crosses appeared on doors in our parish. When I returned that autumn, the workshop stood as I had left it, but the world beyond its walls had changed utterly. There was a hollowness to the city now, a quietness that had nothing to do with the reduction in numbers. People walked differently. They touched less. They watched each other's faces for signs of the fever that might bloom overnight. Master Cornelius was an apothecary of the old learning, trained in Leiden and possessed of more books than any man I have known before or since. His shop occupied the ground floor of a timber-framed house in Cheapside, 3 doors down from the sign of the Golden Heart, and it was a place of marvels to my younger self. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling beams, sage and wormwood, hyssop and rue, turning slowly in the draughts that found their way through the shutters. Glass vessels of every size lined the shelves, alembics and retorts, crucibles and cucurbits, all catching the light like frozen water. The air tasted of things I could not name, bitter and mineral and green all at once. It was in this place that I learnt my trade, and it was here that the bottled vapours were born, though the idea did not originate with us. The notion had been travelling through the city for months, whispered in taverns and discussed in the precincts of the Royal Society, debated by physicians and dismissed by many, yet taken up with fervour by those who remembered too well the summer, when the weekly bills of mortality had climbed past 7,000 souls. The theory, as Master Cornelius explained it to me one grey morning, whilst we ground powders with mortar and pestle, rested upon the ancient understanding of miasma. The sickness that walked the streets, he said, was born of corrupted air, of vapours rising from filth and decay, from the river at low tide, from the narrow courts where the sun never reached, and the gutters ran with things better left unexamined. This much had been known since the time of Galen. But if bad air could bring illness, then surely good air, pure air, wholesome air, air taken from places of health and virtue, might restore what the miasma had corrupted. Would you have thought it foolish? Perhaps you would, sitting as you do in your own time with your own certainties. But we had watched friends sicken and die within days, had seen the buboes swell beneath the jaw and in the hollow of the groin, had heard the cries of the night carts and smelled the smoke of the plague fires. We had no better answers. The physicians could not cure it. Prayer alone seemed insufficient. What remained but to grasp at whatever thread of hope presented itself? The first bottles we prepared were simple enough. Master Cornelius obtained them from a glassmaker in Southwark, thick-walled vessels with ground stoppers that could be sealed with wax. We filled them with air taken from his sister's garden in Hertfordshire, where rosemary and lavender grew in profusion, and the wind blew clean from the hills. I myself travelled there with a basket of empty bottles, and in the early morning, when the dew still clung to the leaves, I would unstop each one and let it sit among the herbs for an hour or more, that the air might enter and be transformed by proximity to these wholesome plants. Then I would seal them quickly, whilst the glass was still cool, and melt wax around the stopper to hold the contents fast. We fixed a label to each one, written in Master Cornelius's careful hand. Air of Hertfordshire garden, gathered at dawn amongst medicinal herbs, for the purification of corrupted atmosphere. We sold them for 2 shillings each, which was not cheap, but neither was it ruinous, and within a week we had no bottles remaining. The demand astonished us. People came to the shop asking not if the air worked, but which air was best, whether morning air was superior to evening air, whether the air of one county might be more efficacious than another. Master Cornelius, being a man of conscience, was careful to explain that the bottles contained no medicine as such, only air that had passed through wholesome places. But his customers heard what they wished to hear, and they bought eagerly, clutching their vials as though they held the very breath of angels. I remember one woman in particular, a mercer's widow dressed in mourning silk so deep it seemed to drink the light. She had lost her husband and both her sons to the pestilence, and though a year had passed, she still moved through the world as one walking in her sleep. She bought 6 bottles of our Hertfordshire air, and when Master Cornelius asked gently how she meant to use them, she said she would open one in each room of her house, that the good air might drive out any remnant of the sickness that had taken her beloved ones. What could we say to her? That air was merely air, that geography and herbs could not transform its essential nature, that her grief had led her to place faith in something that had no power to help her. We said nothing. We took her coins and watched her leave, and I think we both felt the weight of what we had done, though neither of us spoke of it. But the trade grew. Other apothecaries and vendors took up the practice, each with their own variations. A physician near St. Paul's sold air captured from the countryside beyond Hampstead, claiming the elevation made it particularly pure. A woman in Covent Garden offered bottles filled with the air of churches, sealed during services when prayer was thick upon the atmosphere. Some sold air gathered in gardens where no sickness had ever struck. Others promised air taken from the chambers of the healthy and vigorous, as though wellness itself might be contagious in the way that pestilence was. And then, inevitably, the practice took a stranger turn. For if good air could be bottled and sold, what of the air that came from the body itself? What of the breath of those who had survived the plague, who carried within them, perhaps, some quality that had allowed them to resist the infection? What of the aged, whose longevity suggested a constitutional strength? What of the pious, whose devotion might have purified their very essence? It sounds absurd, does it not, when spoken plainly? Yet at the time it seemed to follow a certain logic. We knew that the breath was the medium of life, that it carried something vital from the air into the blood, though we did not understand the mechanism. We knew that some people sickened whilst others in the same house remained well. If the air around us could be corrupted, why should the air within us not be either tainted or preserved according to our constitutions? The first vendor to openly sell human vapours was a man named Gabriel Finch, who had set up a stall near the Royal Exchange. He was a survivor of the plague himself, marked by scars where the buboes had broken and healed, and he claimed that his breath contained some protective quality, some essence of resistance that had kept him alive when so many had perished. He would breathe into bottles for a fee, sealing them whilst they were still warm from his lungs, and he sold them to those who feared the return of the pestilence. I thought him a charlatan, and I said as much to Master Cornelius. But my master, who was a more thoughtful man than I, pointed out that we ourselves had been selling air based on no firmer principle than geography and association. If we could claim that air passed through a garden was somehow improved, By what reasoning could we deny that air passed through healthy lungs might not also be transformed? We had no way to measure or prove either proposition. We were all of us guessing, he said, trying to impose pattern and meaning upon forces we did not comprehend. Still, I could not bring myself to approve of Finch's trade, though I could not fully articulate why. Perhaps it was something in the transaction itself, the intimacy of it, the way he would take a bottle, press it to his lips, and exhale slowly into the glass, his cheeks hollowing as he expelled the breath from his chest. There was something unseemly in it, something that made the people watching look away even as they waited their turn to purchase his wares. It was too close, somehow, to the body itself, to the processes we preferred not to contemplate. Yet people bought from him. They bought from others who took up the same trade. Within months, there were vendors throughout the city offering captured breath, each with their own particular claim to efficacy. Old men sold the exhalations of their longevity. Women who had borne many children sold the breath of fertility. A priest near Westminster Abbey offered vapours sanctified by prayer, breathed out whilst in a state of devotion. And then there were those who went further still, who captured not merely breath, but the airs released from other parts of the body, sealed into bottles and sold as containing the very essence of health and vigour. I shall not describe these transactions in detail, for they were performed in back rooms and whispered about rather than openly advertised. But they existed. People paid for them. The trade in human vapours expanded into territories that made even Gabriel Finch seem almost respectable by comparison. Master Cornelius would have nothing to do with these developments. He continued to sell only the air of gardens and countryside, clearly labelled and modestly priced. But I could see that the whole business troubled him. One evening, as we closed the shop and locked away the day's takings, he said to me, "We have unleashed something we cannot control. We meant to offer comfort, but we have fed a hunger that grows beyond all reason." I asked him what he thought we should do, and he was silent for a long while. Outside, the lamplighter was making his rounds, and we could hear the tap of his pole against the posts, the brief flare of flame as each lantern caught. Finally, Master Cornelius said, "I do not know. If we cease selling our bottles, others will still sell theirs. If we speak against the practice, we shall only sound like hypocrites. For are we not the ones who began it? We have opened a door, and I fear what may walk through." The winter of that year was bitter cold, the Thames freezing solid enough that frost fairs were held upon it, with tents and booths erected on the ice. The plague had not returned, but other sicknesses moved through the population. Fevers and fluxes, coughs that settled in the chest and would not leave. People died, as they always had in winter, of cold and hunger, and the illnesses that preyed upon the weak. Yet now there was a new element to their suffering, a new category of expense. They bought bottles of air when they could not afford bread. They purchased captured vapours when they needed fuel for heating. I remember seeing a family in St. Giles, the father thin as a shadow, the children with that hollow look that spoke of empty bellies. The mother clutched a bottle of healing vapour purchased from some street vendor, and she would unstop it periodically and wave it beneath the children's noses, as though the air itself might nourish them. Master Cornelius, who had accompanied me on a delivery to a physician in that district, stopped and spoke to her. He asked how much she had paid for the bottle, and when she told him, 6pence, which was perhaps a quarter of what they needed to feed the family for a week, I saw his face change. He took out his purse and gave her a shilling, saying nothing, and we walked on in silence. That night, he told me he would cease selling the bottled air. He said he could no longer participate in a trade that took money from those who needed it most, offering them nothing but belief in return. I asked him what we would do instead, for the bottles had become a significant portion of our income, and he said we would return to the honest practice of pharmacy, selling medicines that actually contained medicinal compounds, however imperfect their effects. It was easier said than accomplished. The demand for bottled air showed no signs of diminishing, and our customers did not thank us for our newfound scruples. They went elsewhere, to the dozens of other vendors who had taken up the trade. Some accused us of abandoning them in their need. Others suggested we had discovered some danger in the practice and were keeping it secret. A few seemed to understand, but they were the minority. The trade itself continued to evolve in directions both ingenious and disturbing. Entrepreneurs began offering subscription services, whereby for a monthly fee they would deliver fresh bottles of captured air to your door, gathered from whatever source you preferred. Some collected air from famous places, from the Tower of London, from the precincts of St. Paul's, from the chambers where Parliament met. One enterprising soul offered air captured from the private galleries where the king himself had walked, though how he obtained such access remained mysterious. The claims grew more elaborate: air that could cure barrenness, air that would restore youth, air that carried the intellectual vigour of university fellows, bottled in Cambridge and Oxford, and sold to those who wished their children might be clever. Air from the bedsides of the dying, which some believed contained the departing soul, and might therefore offer insight into the mysteries of mortality. Air from places where miracles had been reported, sealed at the moment of revelation. It became impossible to distinguish the sincere from the fraudulent, for sincerity itself was perhaps fraudulent, based as it was upon beliefs that had no foundation beyond desperation and hope. Gabriel Finch, whom I dismissed as a charlatan, seemed no worse than the others, and perhaps better, for at least he sold only what he himself produced, making no false claims to have captured airs from impossible sources. I saw him one day in a tavern near Smithfield, sitting alone by the fire with a cup of ale before him. He looked older than I remembered, worn down by something I could not name. On impulse, I bought a second cup and sat across from him. We had never spoken before, and he regarded me with suspicion until I told him I meant no trouble, that I simply wished to understand his trade. He laughed at that, a bitter sound. "You wish to understand? You, whose master began this whole cursed business with his bottles of garden air. There is nothing to understand. People are frightened, and they will pay for anything that promises relief from their fear. I breathe into bottles because it earns me coin, and I tell myself it does no harm. Perhaps I even believe it. The mind is a strange country, is it not? We can convince ourselves of anything if the need is great enough." I asked him if he thought the vapours held any true efficacy, and he looked at me as though I were simple. "Efficacy? Lad, I do not know what air is, let alone whether my breathing into a bottle changes it in any fashion. The learned men argue about such things, and they know no more than I do. But I will tell you this. People feel better after they have bought my wares. Whether that is because of what is in the bottle or what is in their heads, I cannot say, but they feel better, and is that not worth something?" It was a question I had no answer for then, and I am not certain I have one now. We spoke a while longer, and he told me that he had been a printer before the plague, with a wife and 2 daughters. All 3 had perished within a week of each other, and when he recovered from his own sickness, he found he could not return to his former trade. The smell of ink sickened him. The pressure of the press reminded him of weight upon the chest, of the suffocation that came with the fever. He had tried other work, labouring, carrying, anything to keep himself fed, but nothing suited him. Then one day, someone asked him if he would breathe into a bottle for them, having heard it said that survivors of the plague might carry protection in their breath, and he had done so for a penny. "And that is how it began," he said, staring into his ale. "A penny for my breath. Now I can earn more in a week than I made in a month as a printer, and all I need do is exhale. Tell me, is that fortune or curse?" I had no answer for him then, and we parted without further words, but I thought about our conversation often in the days that followed. For all my initial disgust at his trade, I could not deny that there was something honest in his explanation, more honest perhaps than the elaborate justifications offered by physicians and scholars who should have known better, but who nonetheless participated in the commerce of captured air. The spring of 1668 brought new variations on the theme. A group of natural philosophers, gentlemen of independent means who met regularly to discuss the latest discoveries in mechanics and astronomy, announced that they had developed a method for preserving not merely air, but specific qualities of air. They had constructed a device, they claimed, that could separate the wholesome elements of breath from the corrupted ones, producing a concentrated essence of vitality that could be sealed in bottles and administered in measured doses. Master Cornelius and I were invited to observe a demonstration of this apparatus, which took place in a fine house near Bloomsbury. The device itself was an elaborate construction of glass tubes and copper chambers, with valves and condensers arranged in a fashion that suggested both ingenuity and desperation. The principle, as it was explained to us, involved passing air through various solutions, water infused with herbs, spirits of wine, diluted acids, each of which would supposedly remove different categories of impurity until only the refined essence remained. We watched as one of the philosophers breathed into the apparatus, his exhalation travelling through the maze of tubes and chambers, bubbling through the various liquids, emerging finally as a small quantity of vapour that was captured in a glass receiver and quickly stoppered. The demonstration took perhaps half an hour, and at the end of it we were shown a vial no larger than my thumb, containing what was claimed to be the purified essence of human breath, stripped of all corrupting influences. The cost of producing such a vial, we were told, was considerable. The apparatus itself represented a significant investment, and the reagents were expensive. But the resulting product, they assured us, was immeasurably superior to the crude captured airs being sold on the streets. This was science, they said. This was reason applied to the challenge of preserving health. Master Cornelius asked whether they had tested the efficacy of their product, whether anyone had been cured of sickness through its use. The philosophers exchanged glances, and one of them, a portly gentleman with a magnificent wig, cleared his throat and explained that they were in the early stages of investigation, that proper trials would take time, but that the theoretical foundation was sound. The miasma theory, he said, was well established. If sickness came from corrupted air, then purified air must logically combat it. We left that house with a bottle of the precious essence given to us as a token of their esteem, and on the walk back to Cheapside, Master Cornelius was silent. Finally, as we turned into our own street, he said, "They believe it, you know. They are not deliberately deceiving anyone. They have convinced themselves that their reasoning is sound, that their apparatus works as they claim. And perhaps in some fashion it does. Perhaps passing air through all those liquids does change it in ways we cannot detect. But they have no more proof than Gabriel Finch has, for all their fine equipment and learned discourse." That evening, we unpacked the bottle they had given us and examined it by candlelight. The liquid inside, for it was liquid rather than air, a pale amber fluid that moved sluggishly when tilted, smelled faintly of alcohol and something else, something organic and indefinable. Master Cornelius unstoppered it and waved it beneath his nose, then handed it to me. I inhaled cautiously. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that suggested healing or purity or any of the qualities that had been claimed for it. "Shall we sell it?" I asked, and Master Cornelius laughed, though there was no mirth in the sound. "We could," he said. "We could place it in the window with a fine label and charge £1 for it, and someone would buy it within the hour. But we shall not. We shall keep it as a curiosity, a reminder of what happens when intelligent men fool themselves into believing they have solved mysteries that remain opaque to understanding." He placed the bottle on a high shelf behind some other vessels, where it remained for years afterwards, gathering dust. I used to look at it sometimes, wondering about the men who had created it, whether they still believed in their apparatus, whether they had ever administered their essence to anyone, and what the results had been. But I never learned the answers to those questions. The trade in bottled vapours reached its apex that summer. There were vendors on every street corner, offering airs of every description. The wealthy had rooms in their houses dedicated to the storage and display of their collections, bottles arranged by type and source, labelled and catalogued like wines in a cellar. There were connoisseurs who could supposedly detect subtle differences between airs, who claimed that the breath captured in morning had a different quality from that captured in evening, that the vapours of spring differed from those of autumn. Treatises were published on the subject. A physician named Edmund Hartley wrote a volume titled Discourse on the Aerial Virtues, in which he argued that different organs produce different qualities of breath, and that by careful analysis one might develop bottles specific to particular ailments. The liver, he claimed, produced warm and moist exhalations that were beneficial for cold and dry conditions. The spleen produced cold and dry airs suited to treating hot and moist imbalances. It was the old humoral theory dressed in new costume, air standing in for blood and bile, but it was taken seriously by many. Master Cornelius read Hartley's book and set it aside with a heavy sigh. "The learned and the ignorant," he said, "arrive at the same foolishness by different paths. The street vendor sells breath in a bottle because he needs money. The physician writes a treatise justifying the same practice because he needs to believe he understands the world. Neither knows anything true, but one is at least honest about his ignorance. And yet, for all his cynicism, I noticed that Master Cornelius did not speak out publicly against the trade. When customers came seeking his opinion, he gave it carefully, neither endorsing nor condemning the practice, but suggesting that they spend their money first on proven medicines, on Peruvian bark for fevers, on mercury compounds for the pox, on the preparations that had centuries of use behind them, however imperfect their effects. Some listened, most did not. I think he felt, as I was beginning to feel, a kind of helplessness in the face of it all. We had helped to begin something we could not stop, and it had taken on a life of its own beyond our control or influence. It was like watching a child grow into a stranger, carrying forward some resemblance to its origins, but transformed into something neither parent could have anticipated or desired. The autumn brought a new development that shook even my growing fatalism. A woman was discovered in Whitechapel, dead in a rented room, surrounded by perhaps 200 bottles of various airs. She had been ill for some time, a wasting sickness of the lungs, and she had spent her entire fortune, modest as it was, purchasing vapours that promised to heal her. When she had no more money, she had sold her possessions to buy more bottles. When the possessions were gone, she had apparently ceased eating, preferring to spend what little she had on additional airs rather than on bread. The coroner's verdict was starvation, but that was not the whole truth. She had died of belief, of hope carried past the point of reason, of faith in the bottled air that sat unopened around her, dozens and dozens of vials that she had purchased but never used, as though their mere presence might be sufficient to cure her. Master Cornelius went to see the room. I do not know why. Perhaps he felt some responsibility, though we had never sold anything to this woman. When he returned, he looked older than I had ever seen him. He told me to pack away all our equipment for preparing bottled air, and I did so without question, knowing that we would not resume the practice. We had made that decision months earlier, but now it was final, sealed with the image of that room full of useless bottles surrounding a body too light to properly lay out. Yet the trade continued. If anything, it grew. The woman's story became known, and rather than serving as a warning, it seemed to strengthen people's belief in the efficacy of the vapours. Had she not spent her last resources acquiring them? Surely that proved their value. Had she not died surrounded by bottles? Perhaps she had simply waited too long to use them, or had not used enough, or had not obtained the proper variety. The lesson people drew was not that the bottles were worthless, but that one must start using them earlier, must purchase more, must be more discerning in selecting the proper airs for one's condition. I grew sick of it all, sick of the pretense, sick of watching people trade their coins for glass and air, sick of the elaborate justifications that physicians and philosophers spun to explain why their particular method of capturing vapours was superior to all others. I told Master Cornelius I wished to leave London, to travel perhaps, to see if other places had fallen into the same madness, or if this was a peculiarly English affliction. He gave me his blessing, and a small purse of coins, and in the spring of 1669 I took ship to Amsterdam, where I had some vague notion of studying with the Dutch physicians who were said to be advancing the science of anatomy and the understanding of disease. I was young enough still to believe that somewhere there existed people who knew true things, who could distinguish reality from belief, who could show me how to practice medicine without deception. Amsterdam was a revelation, though not in the way I had hoped. The Dutch were as caught up in the trade of bottled vapours as the English, though they approached it with characteristic thoroughness. Where London had street vendors and eccentric philosophers, Amsterdam had organised guilds of air merchants, with regulations governing the collection and sale of captured airs, with official seals and certificates of provenance. You could purchase air from specific locations throughout the Republic, each bottle accompanied by documentation attesting to its origin. Air from the dunes near Haarlem, air from the Zuiderzee, air from the cheese markets of Alkmaar. There were shops dedicated entirely to the trade, with walls lined with bottles arranged by region and date, with ledgers recording the movements of inventory. The Dutch had taken an English folly and systematized it, brought order and commerce to chaos, and somehow this made it worse, for it lent an appearance of legitimacy that the haphazard English market had lacked. When a vendor on a London street corner sold you bottled breath, you knew you were taking a chance. When a licensed Dutch merchant in a proper establishment sold you air certified by the Guild and accompanied by official documentation, it was much easier to believe you were buying something real. I found work with an apothecary near the Oude Kerk, a man named Peter van Leeuwenhoek, who had no connection to the famous microscope maker, but traded freely on the confusion. He was kind enough, but deeply invested in the air trade, and he set me to preparing bottles according to a complex schedule he had developed, which held that the medicinal properties of air varied according to the phase of the moon and the position of certain planets. I did as I was told, for I needed the wage, but I found no pleasure in it. Each morning I would rise before dawn and go to whatever location Peter had designated for that day's collection, a garden, a church, a public square, and I would open bottles and let them sit for the prescribed amount of time before sealing them and carrying them back to the shop. Then I would write out the labels in my careful hand, noting the location, the date, the time, the astrological conditions. Peter would inspect my work, nodding with satisfaction, and place the bottles in the window where they would sell before evening. I lasted 6 months in Amsterdam before I could bear it no longer. The Dutch efficiency, the guild regulations, the careful documentation, all of it made the absurdity somehow more unbearable rather than less. At least in London there had been a certain chaotic honesty to the trade. Here it had been captured and tamed and turned into just another business, as respectable as selling cheese or herring. I returned to England in the autumn to find that Master Cornelius had died in my absence, of an apoplexy that had struck him whilst he worked in the shop. His sister had inherited the business and had immediately sold it to a younger apothecary who saw no problem with the bottled air trade, and who had, I later learned, expanded it significantly, even going so far as to develop his own breathing apparatus modelled on the device I had seen demonstrated 2 years earlier. I did not seek employment with him. Instead, I took a position with a physician in Surrey, a man of traditional learning who practiced medicine as it had been practiced for centuries, bleeding and purging, administering compounds of mercury and antimony, reading the urine and feeling the pulse. His treatments were no more effective than the bottled air, and in some cases rather more harmful, but there was something oddly comforting in their very antiquity. No one pretended they represented new understanding. They were simply what had always been done, and if they did not cure, well, at least they did not pretend to be based on recent discoveries or revolutionary principles. The years passed. I married, had children, watched them grow. The trade in bottled vapours continued, though it gradually changed character, becoming absorbed into the larger market for patent medicines and proprietary remedies. The specific practice of selling captured air declined as new fashions emerged. Mineral waters, electrical treatments, magnetism, all the succession of hopeful theories that parade through medical practice like soldiers marching to war. By the time I was 40, the bottled air trade had mostly disappeared from London, though it persisted in some rural areas where news travelled slowly and old beliefs died hard. When people spoke of it at all, it was with mild embarrassment, as something their parents or grandparents had believed in, back when ignorance was more excusable than it had since become. The new generation, raised on accounts of Harvey's circulation and Leeuwenhoek's animal cules, could not fathom how anyone had ever thought that air itself might be medicine. And yet, in my darker moments, I wondered whether we had truly progressed, or merely traded one form of ignorance for another. The new medicines that were hailed as discoveries, were they really more effective than what had come before? People still sickened, people still died. Physicians still prescribed treatments based on theory rather than proof, still convinced themselves they understood what remained mysterious. The bottles were different, the theories more elaborate, but the fundamental transaction remained unchanged. Desperate people giving money to those who claimed to help them, and receiving in return something that might be medicine, or might be nothing, and who could say for certain which was which? I am old now, as I said at the beginning, and I have seen many things in my long life. I have seen theories rise and fall, treatments lauded and then abandoned, certainties revealed as mere belief. And I have come to think that perhaps we were not entirely foolish in those days when we sold captured air to frightened people in a plague-haunted city. For what were we really selling? Not air, certainly. Air is free, available to anyone who opens their mouth and breathes. We were selling the possibility of control in a world that seemed increasingly ungovernable. We were selling the illusion that human effort could capture and contain the invisible forces that determined life and death. We were selling hope, and hope is never foolish, however much the thing hoped for may prove to be illusory. Would you have bought a vial of air if the pestilence had already touched your street? If you had heard the bells tolling daily for the departed, if you had seen the carts piled with the quiet forms of those who would wake no more, if you had felt the fever beginning in your own flesh and known that you had perhaps 3 days before the end, would you have refused a bottle that promised protection, even if you suspected deep down that the promise was empty? I cannot answer for you, but I know what I would have done, what I did do in my own fashion. We bought and sold those bottles because we needed to believe we were not helpless, that we could do something, anything, to ward off the darkness that pressed so close around us. And if that belief was false, if the bottles contain nothing but ordinary air, well, perhaps there is medicine in belief itself, something that eases the spirit even if it cannot heal the flesh. Master Cornelius understood this, I think, better than I did at the time. He knew the bottles were worthless, but he also knew that people needed them, and he could not quite bring himself to condemn the trade even when he ceased to participate in it. He saw the whole business clearly, saw both the deception and the need that made the deception possible, saw that they were tangled together in ways that could not easily be separated. I think of him often now, as I sit in my chair by the fire and watch the light fade from another day. I think of his shop with its hanging herbs and glass vessels, of his careful labels and his troubled conscience, of the way he tried to navigate between compassion and honesty, and found that the path was narrower than he had imagined. He was a good man in a difficult time, doing work that was perhaps necessary even if it was not entirely honourable, and that is more than can be said for many. The bottles themselves are all gone now, broken or lost or discarded, once their contents were judged worthless. But sometimes in my memory I can still see them lined up on the shelf, catching the light from the window, holding their invisible contents. Glass vessels filled with air and hope, sealed with wax and labelled with care, each one a small monument to human need and human credulity, and human stubbornness in the face of mortality. They said the cure lay in the breath itself, and we believed them because we had to believe something. They said that life could be captured and preserved, that wellness could be bottled and sold, that the invisible could be grasped if only we were clever enough, faithful enough, desperate enough. And we tried, all of us, in our various ways, to hold on to something that could not be held. I have one bottle still, kept not for any medicinal purpose but as a curiosity, a relic of those strange years. It sits on the shelf beside my bed, a small glass vessel with a ground stopper sealed with wax that has gone yellow and cracked with age. The label, written in my own hand more than 40 years ago, reads, "Air of Hertfordshire Garden, gathered amongst rosemary and lavender, May 1667. It was one of the first bottles I ever prepared, and I kept it back when we sold the others, though I could not have said why at the time. Sometimes, late at night when sleep will not come, I take it down and hold it up to the candlelight. The glass is clouded now, fogged from within by some process I do not understand. Perhaps moisture has crept in despite the seal. Perhaps the air itself has changed, transformed by time in ways that would have delighted the natural philosophers who claim to understand such things. Or perhaps it was always clouded, and I simply never noticed until years had passed and I had learned to see more clearly. What is in that bottle now? Is it still the air of a Hertfordshire garden, or has it become merely the air of a sealed vessel, cut off from the world and grown stale in isolation? Did it ever contain anything more than ordinary air, or was the garden's influence merely something we imagined, a quality projected onto the invisible by our desperate need to believe in transformation? I do not open it. I never shall. To open it would be to answer questions I have grown comfortable leaving unanswered. The bottle has become a kind of shrine, not to the air it contains, but to the time when we believed such things mattered, when we thought we could trap healing in glass and sell it for silver. My grandson came to visit last month, a clever boy of 15 with his head full of the new learning. He studies with a physician in Cambridge, and he speaks confidently of chemistry and mechanics, of the circulation of the blood and the function of the lungs. He saw the bottle on my shelf and asked me what it was, and when I told him, he laughed, not unkindly, but with the certainty of youth that knows it understands the world better than those who came before. "But, grandfather," he said, "surely you knew it was nonsense. Air is simply air, wherever it comes from. How could anyone believe that air from one place was different from air from another?" I did not argue with him. What would have been the point? He lives in a different world than the one I knew in my youth, a world where the plague is a memory rather than a present terror, where the Royal Society publishes careful experiments rather than speculative theories, where understanding, however incomplete, has begun to replace pure guesswork. He cannot imagine what it was like to live when death walked the streets and no one knew why some lived and others died, when the physicians could offer no better explanation than corrupted air and no better cure than bleeding and prayer. And yet, I wonder if his world is truly so different from mine. He speaks with such confidence about what is known, but I've lived long enough to see certainties become questions, and questions become new certainties that will themselves someday be doubted. The medicine he studies will seem as foolish to his grandchildren as the bottled air seems to him, and they will wonder how anyone could have believed in treatments that seem, from their vantage point, so obviously misguided. For we are all of us, in every age, selling bottled air in one form or another. We are all grasping at invisible things, trying to contain what cannot be contained, offering certainty when we have only hope. The forms change, the theories grow more elaborate, the vessels become more sophisticated, but the fundamental human need remains the same, to believe that we can control our fate, that we can hold back the darkness, that death is not the final word if only we can find the right remedy, speak the right prayer, purchase the right protection. I said this once to a physician of my acquaintance, a learned man who had studied in Padua and who spoke 5 languages. He did not disagree with me, but neither did he seem troubled by the comparison. "Perhaps," he said, "the difference lies not in whether we sell hope, but in whether we know we are doing so. Your bottled air was sold by people who believed in it, or at least half believed, and that made them honest in their way. We who practice medicine now know better the limits of our knowledge, know that we are often guessing, and yet we must still act, still prescribe, still offer something to those who come to us in need. Is that not a different kind of honesty?" I've thought about his words often in the years since that conversation. Is it better to sell false hope knowingly or unknowingly? Is there less deception in admitting uncertainty, or does the admission itself become another kind of performance, a way of seeming honest while still taking payment for services that may do nothing? I cannot say. These are questions for philosophers, and I am only an old man who once prepared bottles of air for frightened people in a time of plague. What I can say is this: we were not wicked, those of us who participated in that trade. We were not deliberately cruel. We were simply human, trying to survive in circumstances that exceeded our understanding, reaching for any tool that seemed like it might help, any theory that offered explanation, any practice that suggested control. We wanted to heal. We wanted to help. We wanted to believe that our work mattered, that we were not merely witnesses to suffering but could actually alleviate it. And perhaps, in some small way, we did help, though not in the manner we imagined. Perhaps there is a kind of healing in the transaction itself, in the moment when someone places their coins on the counter and receives in return a bottle sealed with wax, labelled with care, containing something that might be medicine. Perhaps the act of purchasing, the ritual of opening and inhaling, the belief that one has done something to protect oneself. Perhaps these things have their own efficacy, working not on the body but on the spirit, providing comfort if not cure. Or perhaps I am merely an old man trying to justify what cannot be justified, trying to find meaning in actions that had none, trying to believe that my life's work amounted to something more than the selling of sealed air to desperate people. That is the curse of memory, is it not? We remember what we did, and we must either condemn ourselves or find some way to understand. to forgive, to reconcile the actions of our youth with the wisdom of our age. I choose understanding, though it comes hard. I choose to believe that we were doing the best we could with what we knew, that our failures were failures of knowledge rather than character, that we would have done better if we had known better. Perhaps that too is an illusion, a final bottle of air I sell to myself to ease the weight of years. But if so, it is an illusion I can afford, here at the end, when judgment matters less than peace. The candle burns low as I write these words, and outside my window the night is dark and still. Somewhere in London people are sleeping, and some of them are sick, and some of them will not wake to see another morning. The physicians will attend them with their modern remedies, their improved understanding, their better theories. Some will recover, and the physicians will take credit. Some will die, and the physicians will say they did all that could be done. It is the same pattern that has played out for centuries, and will play out for centuries more, until perhaps some distant age finds answers that elude us still. And perhaps, in that distant time, someone will look back at our era and wonder how we could have believed what we believed, done what we did, trusted in methods that seem so obviously flawed from the clarity of hindsight. Perhaps they will shake their heads at our ignorance, our superstition, our willingness to accept explanation that had no basis in fact. Perhaps they will write about us the way my grandson speaks of the bottled air trade, with affectionate condescension, with the certainty of those who know better. I hope they will be kind in their judgment. I hope they will remember that we were human, that we feared and hoped and loved and died just as they do, that we were trying to make sense of a world that often made no sense, that we were reaching for light in the darkness, even when we could not see clearly what we reached for. I hope they will understand that ignorance is not the same as foolishness, that error is not the same as evil, that the history of human healing is not a story of villains and heroes, but of people doing their best in impossible circumstances. In the end, the vials clouded, their contents lost to time and decay. The glass that once seemed so clear, so perfectly suited to display the invisible air within, became opaque and useless. The stoppers loosened or broke away, the wax seals crumbled. What had been preserved was released back into the world, mingling with the common air, indistinguishable once more from the ordinary atmosphere that surrounds us all. Yet I sometimes wonder if they truly held nothing, those bottles we prepared with such care in Master Cornelius's workshop all those years ago. I wonder if, for a brief moment, they contained what every soul once seeks, a breath of faith against the dark, a gesture of defiance against mortality, a small glass prison for the hope that refuses to die, even when reason says it should. We are all of us trapped in time, sealed like air in bottles, waiting for the moment when the seal breaks and we are released. And while we wait, we fill our days with whatever gives them meaning, work and love, beauty and understanding, the small rituals that make life bearable. We know, if we are honest, that none of it will save us, that the seal must break, that every bottle must eventually empty, but we persist nonetheless, because persistence is the human gift, the stubborn refusal to accept that our efforts are meaningless, that our hopes are vain, that all our captured air amounts to nothing. Perhaps that is what we were really selling in those dim years after the plague, not medicine, but that stubborn persistence, that refusal to surrender. Perhaps the bottles were mirrors more than vessels, reflecting back to our customers their own determination to survive, to hope, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. And if that is so, then perhaps we were not charlatans after all, but merchants of something real, even if we could not name it, even if it had no weight or substance, even if it vanished the moment we tried to grasp it. I set down my pen now, for my hand grows tired and the candle is nearly burnt to nothing. The bottle sits on its shelf, clouded and mysterious, holding whatever it holds. I shall not open it. I shall not throw it away. It shall sit there until I am gone, and then perhaps my grandson will find it and laugh at his foolish grandfather who kept such a thing, and then he will discard it, and that will be the end of the story. Or perhaps he will keep it, as I have kept it, not for what it contains, but for what it represents. Perhaps he will look at it sometimes and think of me, and of Master Cornelius, and of all the others who tried in their flawed and human way to ease suffering and postpone death. Perhaps he will see it not as a symbol of ignorance, but as a symbol of hope, of the eternal human effort to make things better, to heal what is broken, to preserve what is precious. And perhaps in that understanding, the bottle will have held something valuable all along, not the air of a Hertfordshire garden, not the breath of health, not the vapour of life itself, but simply this, the memory of people who cared enough to try, who believed enough to act, who hoped enough to reach for the impossible. That is all any of us can do in the end. We reach for the impossible, knowing we shall likely fail, but reaching nonetheless. We bottle our hopes and seal them with wax. We label them with care and offer them to those who need them. And if the contents prove to be only air, only nothing, only the same emptiness that was there before, well, at least we tried, at least we reached, at least we hoped. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be. The last ember glows and fades. The night grows deeper. The bottle sits silent on its shelf, clouded with age, holding its secrets. And I, who prepared it so long ago with hands now still and young, who sealed it with wax now cracked and yellowed, who believed once that it might matter, I close my eyes and remember. The workshop, the herbs hanging in bundles, the morning light through leaded glass, the smell of rosemary and thyme, the sound of coins dropped into trembling hands, the hope in people's faces as they clutched their bottles and walked back into the streets where the sickness waited. We thought we had trapped life itself, the breath of health, the spirit of the living, but all we held was air and our own longing reflected in the glass. And yet, for those who held those bottles, for those brief moments when belief was stronger than doubt, perhaps it was enough. Perhaps it was everything. Perhaps in the end, that is all we have ever had, all we shall ever have, air and glass and hope, sealed together against the darkness, waiting for the light.